"Line," Admiral Arden's voice commanded across the fleet. "Calm, steady, certain," and they did. The Erebus turned its broadside and fired again. The blast was like the wrath of a star, ripping entire formations of Krith ships into shreds. Battleships moved beside it, pouring fire into the enemy with merciless rhythm. Destroyers darted between them, intercepting drones before they could breach the wall. Human fighter swarms danced through the chaos, their cannons shredding machines by the hundreds. They weaved between explosions, fearless, disciplined, never breaking formation. It was not just a fleet. It was an army of fire and fury, and it struck fear into even the heartless Krith. The Allied ships found courage in their shadow. The Corran lit their wings of fire and dove into the enemy beside Terran frigates, burning paths through the swarm. The Thalri crystal lances shone bright, piercing the weak points that human missiles had torn open. The Varian living ships, though scarred and broken, found their voices again, their organic cannons joining the storm. Together, they were no longer prey. They were warriors again. Admiral Talon felt tears sting his eyes. For years, he had believed hope was dead. But as he watched the humans fight, he realized something powerful. Hope had never died. It had only been waiting for humanity. Still, the battle raged without end. The Krith adapted, sending massive leviathans forward, monsters of flesh and steel, bristling with claws longer than destroyers. They crashed into the Terran line, shaking the shields of battleships. Their roars filled the void as they tore through everything in their path, but the humans answered with fury. The Erebus locked onto the largest leviathan. Its weapons glowed, charging with energy so bright the stars themselves seemed to dim. Then with one devastating strike, it unleashed a beam of light that ripped the creature apart in a storm of fire and blood. The battlefield fell silent for a heartbeat. Even the Krith seemed to hesitate, and in that silence, Admiral Arden's voice rang out once more. "Stand firm. We are the shield. We are the fire. Together we will not fall." On every Allied ship, hearts blazed. The despair of the past years was gone, replaced by fury, replaced by hope. The galaxy had been broken, but it was not lost. Not while humanity stood. And as the Terran Armada surged forward, the battlefield itself seemed to bow before their wrath. The fire of humanity had come, and nothing could extinguish it. For hours, it seemed as though the battle would never end. The Krith poured forward in waves, their swarms endless, their hunger unbroken. Every time a cluster of their ships was destroyed, more came to fill the gap. It was like fighting the sea itself, endless and merciless. Yet through the chaos, the Terran Armada did not break. The human fleet moved as one living machine. Battleships held their ground, unleashing thunderous volleys that split enemy lines. Destroyers darted through the gaps, striking like wolves at the Krith swarms. Frigates spread shields to protect the carriers, and fighters swarmed in deadly packs, their movements sharp and precise. It was not desperation that drove them. It was discipline. It was will. Admiral Talon could hardly believe what he was witnessing. His eyes never left the battlefield, his voice quiet with awe. They fight like no others," he whispered. "Every ship knows its place. Every strike has purpose. They are not survivors. They are warriors." The Corran captain beside him spread her fiery wings, her face burning with fierce light. "They are fire given form," she said softly. The Allied officers around them, who had once slumped in despair, now stood tall. The humans had changed them. Where there had been silence and fear, now there was determination. The Krith, however, were not idle. They adapted quickly, reshaping their formations. Their leviathans pressed forward, their enormous bodies covered in spines and claws. Drone swarms poured out from them like rivers of knives. The void became a storm of jagged shapes, each one aiming to tear through the human line. And for a moment the line buckled. A human destroyer was torn apart, ripped open by the swarm. A carrier came under heavy fire, its shields glowing dangerously as drones battered its hull. The Krith pushed harder, roaring across the comms with static-filled shrieks, but the humans answered with fury. Admiral Arden's voice came across the comms. "Calm, sharp, steady, push forward, do not yield, break them." The Erebus fired its main cannons, the blast tearing through a leviathan's chest and sending it spinning into the void. Battleships joined the assault, hammering the enemy with relentless strikes. Missiles surged in perfect waves, striking with precision where the Krith were weakest. The humans pressed forward like a tide of steel. It was then that the Allies found their courage. The Quran dove into the fight beside human fighters, their fiery wings cutting paths through swarms. The Thalri crystal lances blazed with renewed fury, shattering enemy shields where Terran guns had weakened them. The Varian living ships, though scarred, unleashed their organic cannons with haunting cries, fighting shoulder to shoulder with the humans. Admiral Talon stood tall on his bridge, his voice finally strong again. "Allied fleet," he shouted, "support the humans. Strike with them." The broken fleets, once silent, roared to life. The battle changed. Where once the Krith had swarmed freely, now they were trapped between two forces, humanity's unyielding wall and the galaxy's reborn warriors. The Allies no longer fought as prey. They fought as hunters. Together they drove into the swarm. Every volley, every strike carried the weight of survival and vengeance. For the first time, the Krith faltered. One Leviathan after another fell under the combined assault. Their swarms thinned, their formations cracked. The endless tide that had once drowned the galaxy now began to shatter. Admiral Arden's voice echoed again, her words steady and fierce. "Hold your ground. We are turning the tide." The comms filled with shouts of hope, not despair. Alien captains cried out in victory as enemy ships exploded. Crews who had once prepared for death now cheered as they fought. The galaxy, long silent, was finding its voice again. Still, Admiral Talon knew the battle was far from over. The Krith were vast and more would come. But something had changed. Something greater than weapons or ships. The Krith had been unchallenged for years, unstoppable, unbreakable. But now they had met humanity. And humanity had shown the galaxy that the Krith could bleed. Hope was no longer a faint whisper. It was fire. The tide had turned, and the galaxy would never be the same again. Wreckage of ships floated in every direction. Twisted metal, shattered hulls, and silent bodies drifting into the endless dark. Yet the fight had not ended. The Krith still pressed forward, though their formations faltered. They had never known defeat, never faced resistance that did not crumble, but now they hesitated. The Terran Armada had broken their certainty. Admiral Arden stood on the command bridge of the Erebus. Her hands gripped the railing as the reports came in. Human losses were heavy. Thousands of lives had already been given. Yet the enemy's advance was slowing. "Admiral," her second officer said, his voice steady, "the swarm is thinning. Their Leviathans are pulling back." Arden's eyes narrowed. She could sense it too. The Krith were not retreating out of fear. They were preparing something greater. She knew this battle had one last test. Across the void, the shadows stirred. A massive shape emerged from hyperspace, dwarfing even the largest of Leviathans. It was a hive mother, an ancient monster armored with living spines and bristling with endless swarms. Its roar filled every comm channel with static and rage. The Allied fleets froze at the sight. Even the bravest captains felt their courage waver, but Arden's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unyielding. "Humanity has come this far. We will not fall now. All ships form up. This is where we end it." The Terran Armada moved like a blade in the dark, battleships aligned into a spear formation, their cannons charging with blinding light. Carriers released the last of their fighters, swarms of steel wings soaring into the storm. The Allies, though weary, followed suit, rallying behind humanity's unbreakable will. The Hive Mother unleashed her fury. Waves of drones poured out in numbers beyond counting. They struck at shields, tore into hulls, and battered the human lines. But still the Terran wall held. Every gun fired. Every fighter fought. Humanity did not bend. Admiral Talon, watching from his own scarred cruiser, felt his chest tighten. For years the galaxy had bowed in silence before the Krith. But these humans, they did not bow. They rose higher with every strike. "Is this what we were waiting for?" he whispered to himself. "A people who refused to surrender?" His crew looked at him, waiting. And then, with fire in his voice, he shouted, "Allied fleet, stand with them! Strike with them! This is our chance!" Across the comms, alien captains roared their agreement. The galaxy had been silent too long. Now they found their voice again. The battle became a storm of fire and steel. Human dreadnoughts punched holes into the Hive Mother's armor. Corran flame wings streaked across the void, igniting swarms and blazing trails. Thalri crystal lances pierced deep into the beast's hide, weakening its shields. The Varian living ships sang their battle songs, their organic cannons firing with haunting beauty. And at the center of it all, Humanity pressed forward like an unstoppable tide. The Hive Mother shrieked, lashing out with weapons that split moons and shattered fleets. A Terran carrier fell, consumed in a blaze of light. Dozens of frigates were torn apart. Yet the Armada did not Again, perhaps even the humans cannot save us. Then something shifted. The void itself lit up, brighter than 100 suns. A wall of fire stretched across the darkness as the Terran Armada unleashed its first full strike. The human battleships roared to life, their massive cannons shaking the void. Railguns thundered, sending slugs the size of houses tearing through enemy lines. Plasma lances burned bright blue, cutting swathes through the swarm. Guided missiles streaked like falling stars, exploding in waves of destruction that shattered whole enemy formations. The Krith shrieked as their front lines collapsed. Dozens of their warships were torn apart in seconds, ripped open by the sheer force of human firepower. The human fleet did not fight like the others. There was no panic in their movements, no hesitation in their aim. They fought with cold, steady precision. Every shot had purpose. Every maneuver was calculated. Admiral Talon stared in awe. He had expected chaos, desperation. Instead, he saw discipline. Humanity was not struggling to survive. Humanity was fighting to win. Still, the Krith were not defeated. They pressed harder, waves of drones slamming into the humans. Their carriers spat out swarms that blotted out the stars. Entire clouds of jagged machines hurled themselves at the Terran lines. For a moment, the battlefield became chaos. Explosions erupted in every direction. Human frigates weaved between swarms, their point defense cannons shredding drones by the hundreds. Destroyers formed tight shields around carriers, holding their ground even as fire rained upon them. Battleships exchanged blows with Krith leviathans, their shields glowing white under the pressure. The clash shook the void. On the Allied comms, voices began to rise, not cries of despair, but shouts of disbelief and hope. The humans, "They're holding," one captain cried. "They're fighting them back," another shouted. Admiral Talon felt something break inside him. The weight of despair began to lift, replaced by a trembling fire in his chest. He leaned forward, his voice steady for the first time in years. "Allied fleet," he said, "form up behind the humans. Support their fire. We are not finished." And so the broken remnants of the galaxy began to move again. Ships that had once drifted in silence now roared back into formation. The Quran lit their wings and dove into battle beside human frigates. The Thalri crystal lances pierced through enemy shields, striking where human missiles had torn holes. Even the shattered Varian living ships found strength to rise once more, their organic cannons firing alongside Terran railguns. The humans had lit the spark. The galaxy was burning again, not in despair but in defiance. Yet the battle was far from over. The Krith were endless. For every swarm destroyed, more came from the void. The humans were powerful, but they had stepped into a storm unlike any before. Admiral Talon's eyes never left the stars as the clash raged on. His heart pounded, fear and hope colliding within him. The darkness had fallen, but in that darkness a fire had been lit, and the galaxy would not go quietly into the night. The battlefield was chaos. Explosions filled the void, flames lit the broken remains of ships, and the endless swarm of Krith pressed forward with merciless hunger. Allied ships, though inspired by the humans, still cracked and burned under the weight of the assault. But then, the stars themselves seemed to tremble. Space rippled, twisting as if the heavens were tearing open. One by one, massive shadows emerged from hyperspace. At first, it was only a few, dark silhouettes gliding into the fray. But then more appeared, and more still, until the blackness of space was filled with the steel of humanity's armada. The Terran fleet had truly arrived. First came the carriers. They were titans of war, colossal structures of armored black, each bristling with hundreds of launch bays. Their presence dwarfed everything around them. Swarms of human fighters poured from their hangars, sleek and deadly, forming clouds of steel that streaked into battle. Behind them followed the battleships. Each one was a mountain of steel, their hulls carved with scars of past wars. They moved with slow, deliberate power like predators who had no reason to rush. Their weapons glowed with deadly light, waiting to strike. And after them came the destroyers, frigates, and escorts, smaller, faster ships moving in perfect formation. Together they formed walls of steel, a fortress that stretched across the stars. At their heart loomed the Terran flagship, the Erebus. It was a ship so massive it seemed more like a drifting city than a vessel. Its hull was layered with black armor that reflected no light, giving it the appearance of a shadow-given form. Dozens of towers rose from its surface, each bristling with weapons capable of tearing entire fleets apart. The sight alone froze the Allied commanders. None had ever imagined humanity possessed such power. None had believed such a fleet could exist in silence. Hidden from the galaxy, the comms erupted with human voices, disciplined, calm, commanding, form battle lines, targets locked, fire when ready, and then Admiral Arden's voice cut through it all. Firm, steady, absolute. This is the Terran War Armada. Enemy fleet detected. Comments fire. The void exploded with light. Human battleships unleashed broadsides of railgun fire. Massive projectiles tore across the darkness, punching through Krith warships like paper. Plasma lances blazed from destroyers, searing lines through enemy formations. Guided missiles poured from launch bays in coordinated waves, each strike turning clusters of drones into clouds of burning debris. Fighter swarms darted between the enemy, weaving through the Krith's chaotic assault. Their cannons shredded drones with machine precision. For the first time, the Krith faltered. Their swarm was vast, their hunger endless. But the sheer force of humanity's entrance shattered their momentum. Formations broke apart, ships fell into flames. The endless tide had finally met a wall strong enough to hold. On the Allied ships, silence turned to awe. Admiral Talon could hardly believe what he saw. He had expected help, perhaps a few fleets, a handful of reinforcements. But this was an armada the size of legend. His trembling hand steadied on the command table as he whispered, "They came with everything." The current captain spread her fiery wings, her eyes burning with renewed determination. The Thalri general raised his crystal shard high, his voice shaking as he declared, "The gods have not abandoned us. Humanity has come!" Around the galaxy's last defenders, hearts began to beat faster. The despair that had chained them for so long cracked and fell away. For the first time, they believed survival was possible. The Krith, however, did not retreat. They screamed across the void, their ships shrieking as they threw themselves against the human wall of steel. Thousands of drones launched themselves at the Terran fleet, their jagged hulls slamming into shields. Massive Krith carriers poured fresh swarms into the fray. But humanity did not break. The Erebus unleashed its first broadside, a wall of firepower that split the Krith vanguard apart. Entire sections of the swarm vanished in burning silence. Destroyers darted into gaps, frigates shielded the carriers, and fighters returned in flawless formation. Every movement was precise. Every strike was deadly. Admiral Arden's voice returned on the comms, strong and steady. "To all surviving allies, you are not alone. Stand with us. Fight with us. Today the Krith will break." On 100 bridges, commanders raised their heads. On 1,000 decks, crews found strength to fight again. The battlefield was no longer only destruction. It was transformation. The galaxy had been drowning in despair, but now hope was reborn, and it burned in the form of the Terran War Armada, stretching across the stars like an unstoppable storm. The human armada moved like a single living beast, its parts working in perfect harmony. Every ship, from the smallest frigate to the towering Erebus, unleashed fire with relentless precision. The Krith swarm, so vast and endless before, now faced a wall of fury unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Railguns boomed like thunder, their slugs tearing through enemy warships. Plasma lances glowed blue-white, cutting apart carriers in blinding flashes. Missiles streamed in waves, chasing the enemy across the void before erupting into fireballs that lit up the darkness. The Krith shrieked across the comms with their alien static, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of Terran weapons. Admiral Talon stood on the bridge of his battered flagship, watching the impossible unfold. He had seen fleets crumble. He had seen armies vanish, but never had he seen such precision, such cold power, such unstoppable will. The humans did not fight in desperation. They fought as if they had already decided the battle would be theirs. Every shot was deliberate. Every maneuver carried purpose. Talon's chest ached as he whispered, "They do not fight to survive. They fight to win." Around him, his officers straightened. The despair that had bent their shoulders for years began to lift. On the comms, alien captains shouted in voices filled with new strength. The humans had lit a fire inside every heart, but the Krith were not yet broken. They swarmed in even greater numbers, throwing themselves at the human lines with savage hunger. Drones smashed into Terran destroyers, tearing at shields with clawed hulls. Massive enemy carriers opened like jaws, releasing fresh clouds of machines. Their numbers were endless, their madness without limit. A human frigate exploded under the pressure, breaking apart in a blinding flash. Another fell moments later, swallowed by swarms. The Krith pressed hard, their black shapes crawling ever closer. The humans did not waver. The galaxy was silent, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the silence of graves, of burned worlds, and of empty skies where once proud fleets had sailed. For centuries, the great union of species had believed themselves unbreakable. The Quran, with their wings of fire, had soared through the void, their ships moving like living flames. The Thalri, masters of crystal weapons, had carved enemies apart with precision. The Varians, gentle yet strong, had guided living ships grown from their homeworld's oceans. Together, these races had fought off raiders, tyrants, and countless threats. But now all of them were broken. The Krith had come. They were not conquerors in the old sense. They did not enslave. They did not demand surrender. They consumed. They stripped worlds bare, tearing cities apart, feeding on both metal and flesh. Their ships were nightmares of claws and blades, half organic, half machine. When they descended upon a planet, nothing remained but silence. The first battles had been met with courage. The Quran launched wings of flame to strike the Krith. They burned bright, but the swarm swallowed them whole. The Thalri's crystal lances shone like stars, but the enemy was endless. For every vessel destroyed, 10 more appeared. The Varians sent their living fleets, but the Krith cut them open like prey. Battle after battle ended in despair. The galaxy watched as mighty fleets vanished. Now the survivors had gathered near Erathos. Erathos was a scarred planet, once green and beautiful, now only ash and stone. Its skies were filled with wreckage, the corpses of ships that had died in earlier fights. What remained of the Union gathered here, not to win but to resist, to stand for one final battle. Admiral Talon of the Varian stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Lyrian's Grace. His body, tall and pale like crystal, trembled with exhaustion. His eyes, once filled with calm wisdom, now carried only sorrow. Around him the command chamber was quiet. Officers worked at their stations, but their movements were heavy, like those of people waiting for death. Through the glass of the bridge, Talon saw the remains of the fleet. Barely 100 ships scattered and broken. Some were held together by repair beams and patchwork shields. Others drifted with only partial engines. They were not an army. They were ghosts. And beyond them in the distance, the Krith were coming. The sensors showed it clearly. Thousands of ships, swarms of drones, carriers larger than cities. They came in waves, black shapes that blotted out the starlight. Their movements were endless, tireless. They had no fear, no mercy, no soul. Admiral Talon felt his heart sink. His people had fought with honor, but honor meant nothing against the Krith. He knew that in hours, perhaps minutes, this last fleet would burn. Around the chamber, other commanders stood. A Quran captain, her wings folded tight, stared at the floor. A Thalri general clutched a shard of crystal, whispering a prayer to a god who no longer answered. None spoke of victory. None spoke of survival. This was the end. The silence grew heavier as the enemy drew closer. The last light of hope was dying. The galaxy had cried out for help, but no answer had come. Humanity, the youngest race, remained distant, silent in their own space. Many had once asked if humans would join the war, but the question had been forgotten. No one expected them now. Talon closed his eyes. He thought of his homeworld, of the oceans that sang with life. He thought of his family, long gone. He thought of the promise he had made to fight until the end. The comms were quiet, the officers were silent, and the battlefield awaited. And as the endless swarm of Krith ships spread across the void, the last defenders of the galaxy braced themselves for the final storm. The light of hope had faded, but the story was not yet over. Admiral Talon stood still on the bridge, his hands pressed against the cold surface of the command table. The fleet around him drifted in broken formations, their hulls scarred, their engines weak. Every ship was waiting, but none expected survival. The Krith were coming closer. Their swarm moved like a black tide, wave upon wave of jagged ships, the sensors filled with red lights as their numbers grew. Thousands, tens of thousands. There was no end. The Allied commanders spoke little. They no longer had words to give each other courage. The Quran captain stood with folded wings, her fiery eyes dim. The Thalri general had placed his crystal shard beside him, whispering prayers to a fading god. Around them, smaller alien officers slumped at their posts. No one dared to speak of hope. Then the first alarm sounded. The Krith had locked weapons. "Admiral," an officer whispered. "They are preparing to fire." Talon's chest grew heavy. He closed his eyes for a moment, whispering to himself, "So this is how the galaxy ends." But before the first enemy shot was fired, something unexpected broke through the silence. The comms flickered. A signal entered the channel, clear, strong, unlike the static-filled cries they had sent for weeks. A voice spoke, calm, steady, powerful. "This is Admiral Sarah Arden of the Terran War Armada," the voice said. "We have received your distress call. Hold your positions. Do not break. Help is on the way." The bridge froze. Admiral Talon's eyes snapped open. His officers looked at each other in disbelief. The Quran captain's wings spread wide, glowing faintly in surprise. The Thalri general dropped his crystal shard, staring at the comms. "Humanity?" one officer whispered. For years, the humans had been silent. They had joined the galactic stage late, young and untested. They had spoken little, and when the Krith invaded, they did not answer the calls for alliance. Many had assumed they were too weak, too far, too unwilling to risk themselves in the war. But now their voice filled the void. Admiral Arden's tone carried no hesitation. "Allied fleet, stand firm. The battle is not over." Emotions rippled through the bridge. Some officers began to weep quietly. Others straightened in their chairs as if life had returned to their bodies. For so long they had been waiting for death. Now, for the first time in years, someone had promised salvation. Talon could hardly breathe. "Humans, you came," he whispered, his voice shaking. The Krith still advanced. Their ships did not care about words or promises. They only knew hunger. The swarm prepared to strike, but the allies held their breath. Something in that human voice had given them strength to resist, if only for a moment longer. The comms crackled again. "Terran Armada entering system," Admiral Arden announced. "Prepare to fight together." The sensors flared. New readings filled the screens. Hyperspace signatures, dozens at first, then hundreds, then more than anyone could count. Admiral Talon's eyes widened as the stars began to ripple. Space itself bent and tore open. One by one, enormous shapes emerged from hyperspace. The humans had arrived. The arrival begins. First came the carriers, black and immense, their hulls bristling with cannons and launch bays. Then came the battleships, each one a fortress of steel, larger than anything the Allies had ever seen. After them poured frigates, destroyers, escorts, ship after ship, filling the darkness of space until it seemed a new galaxy of lights had been born. At the center of them all loomed the Terran flagship, the Erebus. Towering, dark, and terrifyingly beautiful, it dwarfed every other ship around it. The comms filled again. 100 human voices, sharp and disciplined. Weapons online. Enemy fleet locked. Firing sequence engaged. Admiral Arden's voice spoke last, carrying the weight of humanity itself. "This is the Terran War Armada. We are here, and we do not run." The Allied fleet stared in awe. For so long they had believed humanity was too small, too weak, too distant. But here they were, not a handful of ships, not a token force. An armada, a wall of steel and fire stretching across the battlefield. Admiral Talon's trembling stopped. For the first time in years, his heart steadied. His voice broke as he whispered, "Hope, it has returned." And as the Krith swarm surged forward, the humans opened fire. Krith did not wait. The moment they sensed the arrival of new enemies, their swarm surged forward like a flood of shadows. Thousands of ships poured across the stars, claws flashing, weapons glowing red. They moved without fear, without hesitation, as if eager to devour this new prey. Admiral Talon stood on his bridge, staring in horror. The Krith did not slow. They came in endless numbers, a storm that even the human armada might not hold back. "All ships prepare for impact," shouted a Varian officer. His voice cracked under the weight of terror. The Krith struck first. Their front lines opened fire, launching volleys of energy that lit the black sky. Crimson beams slashed across the Allied ships. Explosions bloomed one after another. A Thalri cruiser cracked apart, shards of glowing crystal scattering like falling stars. A Koran frigate was torn in half, its fiery wings extinguished as it drifted into silence. The survivors screamed across comms, their voices filled with pain and despair. "We cannot hold," cried one captain, moments before his vessel burst into flame. The humans had only just arrived, and already the battlefield was drowning in destruction. The Krith swarmed closer, wrapping around the edges of the Allied fleet. Hundreds of drones slammed into shields, their clawed hulls tearing through armor like paper. They moved like locusts, shredding everything they touched. Admiral Talon gripped the edge of the command table, his knuckles pale. Around him, his officers shouted warnings, reports of lost ships, desperate pleas for orders. He could barely think through the noise. He had led fleets before, but never against something this endless. In his heart, despair whispered,